a CRG series in the Corona times. 6 lectures on migrants and refugees. In collaboration with Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung South Asia and Institute for Human Sciences Vienna. The COVID-19 pandemic has ushered in an era which, even without it, appeared as building on its inheritance of displacement, discrimination, and disparity. Yet, ours is also an era which inherited the idea that empathy isn't alien to law, politics, or to any field of knowledge or activity. That in certain luminous moments, hope and history rhyme. The unprecedented scale of forced displacement, its growing catalysts, and the distress darkening it present immediate challenges for migrants and marginalized people all over the world. The 6 lectures in this series by Calcutta Research Group explore the conditions of migrants in the present day. They investigate issues of protection, vulnerability, neoliberalism, statelessness, international law, and ethics. Lecture 2: Migrants and the Epidemic, Gender, Race, and Other Vulnerabilities. The speaker is Shomata Bishwas from the Sanskrit College and University, Kolkata. The conditions of the new normal take their lessons from the earlier unequal normal. Deprivations emerging from the pandemic often have direct links to entrenched prejudices and inequalities in society. Viewing the present moment as biopolitical, this discussion explores the intersection between migration and public health and the governmental power which marginalizes certain groups in the name of the whole.
Welcome to the theme lecture for Module B of MCRG's 5th Annual Research and Orientation Workshop and Conference. As you know already, this theme tries to locate the fault lines in the world's response to the coronavirus crisis, or what is more popularly called the war on coronavirus. To do so, we will move backwards into history, look at different societies' engagements with epidemics, their commonalities with respect to their attitudes towards migrants and other marginalized people. This presentation is divided in 3 parts. One, we look at historically how epidemics have, in societies, been linked with migrants and other vulnerable population. Two, we try to map the different fault lines and fissures in our societies that make themselves manifest during a pandemic or an epidemic. And three, we look at how the present situation with the migrants has been and what are its ramifications. The context of this module lecture is quite obvious, given our inhabitation in the present moment, bang in the midst of a pandemic. In India, we have witnessed the villainization of people belonging to a specific order as super spreaders. We have witnessed the harassment of people from the northeast of India for their apparent physical similarity with the Chinese. And we have witnessed the long walk to shelter and food by internal migrant workers, brought about by an abrupt national lockdown. But these instances of visible and acute marginalization and suffering were not limited to the Indian context, but all over the world. COVID-19 has unfolded as simultaneously a migrant crisis, a public health crisis, and an economic crisis. This is how Ronobe Shomata describes the present moment, while moving on to inquire in his edited volume, Burdens of an Epidemic, a policy perspective on COVID-19 and migrant workers, who bears the burden of the epidemic and epidemic control measures? Who pays, finally, in terms of life and livelihood? It is from this ideological imperative that I shall situate my lecture. My deliberations are informed by, although it does not detail, Michel Foucault's idea of biopolitics and biopower. Even the word pandemic has the notion of migration built within it. An epidemic is a disease that affects or tends to affect a disproportionately large number of individuals within a population, community, or region at the same time. A pandemic is an epidemic that occurs over a wide geographic area and affects an exceptionally high proportion of the population. It is therefore common sense to assume that for an epidemic to reach pandemic proportions, there has to be movement of people from one part of the globe to another. If today we have stopped celebrating the globalized world order and to a large extent concentrated on national boundaries, the reason is also that with people, information and misinformation could spread. Under globalization, so does diseases. But what we see today is a double bind. We link the spread of the disease to migration, but also find that the most impacted by the disease are the migrants. Not, if not literally, then of course in extension. Is this something new? No. Just like the old adage, those who forget history are doomed to repeat it, each of these instances have been well documented historically. I teach literature at a university in Calcutta. As part of that, one of the texts will deal with, and something that must be familiar with all of you, because of the basis, because this forms the basis of Sigmund Freud's theory of male sexual development. One of the texts I teach is Oedipus Rex, or Oedipus Tyrannus, Oedipus the king. In Sophocles' play, Oedipus Rex, first performed in 429 BCE, the citizens of Thebes come to their king Oedipus asking to be delivered from the plague that is killing the unborn children, young, the old, flowers on the trees droop even before they bloom, and crops die. They say, wasted thus by death on death, all our city perishes, corpses spread infection around. The messenger from the oracle at Delphi tells Oedipus that the answer lies in a foreigner who has been living in Thebes. The great sins that he has committed has polluted this country. We know that these sins are that of patricide and of incest, but we know who, and we also know who that foreigner is, or for that matter, how the play ends. But this may be one of the first artistic expressions of treating the migrant as inherently polluting and polluted both. The mere presence of the migrant has as if brought disease upon the land. However outlandish it may sound, let's ask, are we behaved in any different manner right now? The Greek politician and historian Thucydides was Sophocles' contemporary. He records the plague of Athens that originally began in Ethiopia, traveled through Egypt, Libya, into the Greek Mediterranean world, killing more than 70,000 people. Thucydides and Sophocles use similar terms when describing attempts to deal with the epidemic, as well as descriptions of the epidemic on the human body. In the historical case of Athens and the dramatic case of Thebes, the populace turned to the temples looking for a divine solution to the disaster. It's therefore not difficult to surmise that Sophocles' treatment of the plague as something caused by the moral corruption of an outsider had ramifications in the real world that he sought to represent. Around 250 AD, the plague of Cyprian killed about 5,000 people every day in Rome. In historiography, this instance of the epidemic was named after Cyprian. He was the bishop of Carthage. He wrote exhorting his populace, the Christians, to give aid to their persecutors and to care for the sick. The plague had followed closely in the heels of Emperor Decius's persecution of the Christians for their religious belief and practice. And Cyprian took to his discourse on the morality to enjoin them to live the tenets of their faith. There are two takeaways from this history. One, much of what we know of epidemics and pandemics in the Middle Ages is found in clerical records and journals kept in monasteries. So it's rare to find narratives from victims and survivors. And two, a population that is already persecuted and marginalized tends to get blamed for the disease and its spread as well. This will become even more evident in the colonial context. Take the case of the Black Death of the 14th century, the bubonic or the pneumonic plague. Experts are now veering more towards the bubonic. It was also believed to have originated in the Far East and was introduced in Europe in the 1340s by ships. It killed approximately 34 million Europeans and 16 million Asians and is among the most fatal infectious disease outbreaks in recorded history. But something else happened at the same time, as you see in this image on the right. Widespread attacks on Jews in Europe. Remember, Jews were the original diaspora, the original migrants, but also people who were historically persecuted across Europe. In different cities in Europe, it was rumored that the Jews living in ghettos were poisoning drinking water. The fact that even the Jews were dying from the plague did not stop this spread. The philosopher Jean d'Olmont gives us the example of the 17th century, while in Lorena, in 1627, the plague was called the Hungarian plague. In 1636, it was called the Swedish plague. In 1630, in Toulouse, it was called the Plague of Milan. In Cyprus, Christians massacred Muslim slaves. In Russia, the Tatars were attacked. And in 1665, the British accused the Dutch. So, for the same epidemic, we see the many different people who have been held responsible and therefore have been persecuted for it. Jean d'Olmo says the ones who are potentially to blame, against whom the collective can turn its aggression, are first the foreigners, travelers, marginalized, and all those who are not well integrated into a community. Either because they do not want to accept their beliefs, in the case of the Jews, or because it was necessary to expel them to the edge of the group for obvious reasons, such as the lepers, or simply because they are from somewhere else and as such they are somewhat suspicious. So it seems during an epidemic, societies form themselves centered upon the suspicion of the outsider or the suspicion of whoever is different. In contrast, however, we have the case of the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange is named after the voyager Christopher Columbus. It is the name given to the exchange of travel and food, a travel of food, culture, and diseases between the Americas and Europe. But remember, with the Spanish conquistadors came diseases. Before the invasion of the New World, there was no smallpox, no measles, no chickenpox, no influenza, no typhus, no typhoid or parathyroid fever, no diphtheria, no cholera, no bubonic plague, no scarlet fever, no whooping cough, no malaria. It's estimated that upwards 80 to 95% of Native American population was decimated within the first 100 to 150 years following Columbus's landing in the Americas in 1492. It brought about the fall of the mighty Aztec and Incan civilizations, but it is only in historiography of the 20th century that we have started to have an estimate of the disease that colonialism has taken to its colonies. It has been more convenient because the power is tilted in that manner to blame the colonies for the disease that they have exported to the colonizers. We usually hear only of the opposite. We hear of the Europeans who came to the tropics and quickly succumbed to mysterious fevers and to cholera. So much so that well into the 20th century, diseases were named after their supposed places of origin. Asiatic cholera, Asiatic flu, Asiatic plague. This also gave rise to the miasma theory of diseases, whereby the tropical climate was attributed deadly properties. Much like Orientalism, the miasma theory rode roughshod over all climatic variations. So you could have the same miasma in Egypt as you had in Bengal province in India. The cholera, plague, and malaria epidemics of the 19th century all attested to the role played by power relations in attaching blame as well as in directing the response to the epidemic. In the cholera pandemic of 1870 to 1822, the disease that spread from India to Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Thailand, China, etc., along trade routes, and its second bout in 1829, when it reached from Britain to Canada and from Mexico to Cuba, was called Asiatic cholera and or Oriental cholera. Even after John Snow's conclusive evidence that cholera spread through infected water sources, the changes brought about in sanitation in India and in England were widely different. Remember, England was ruling India. The British called Hindu and Muslim pilgrims, since cholera outbreaks were connected with spots of pilgrimage, a dangerous class, launching specific surveillance system for pilgrimages. Despite knowing that cholera was linked to contaminated water sources, equitable distribution water resources was thought of only in the context of famines, not in the context of cholera. Equitable distribution of water merited the digging of wells. Sometimes the wells had to be dug in private property. At other times, wells that were already in private property had to be commissioned by the government. However, in a deeply caste ridden society like India, the depressed classes and the marginal people hardly ever had access to water resources controlled by the dominant caste Hindus. So even here we see the colonial government's reluctance to interfere with private property impacts people who are part of the depressed classes much more than it impacted people who were not so. In March 2020, sanitary officials in Uttar Pradesh of India sprayed migrant workers returning after a long struggle, sprayed them with chemical disinfectants. This image went viral, but it bore striking similarities to the treatment of the colonized, who were forcibly disinfected in tubs in quarantine camps during an outbreak of plague in Karachi in 1897. Such practices were widespread in contemporary in India in the 19th century. In 1898, the British Medical Journal reported that railway officials in Bombay had disinfected the clothes of all third class passengers with steam under pressure and forced the native to bathe himself thoroughly in a disinfectant solution. But just like the more stringent quarantine measures both now and then were meant for the poorest people, the forcible spraying or sanitation was also only meant for the poor. In Society Must Be Defended, Michel Foucault claims that stigmatization and exclusion are basic dimensions of social normalization. So we become a society and we defend that society but against all the biological threats posed by the other race, the sub race, the counter race that we are despite ourselves bringing into existence. And examples of what Foucault claims abounds well into the 19th and 20th centuries. In the 1890s in New York, Eastern European Jews were singled out for quarantine because they were suspected of carrying cholera and typhus. In San Francisco, the Chinese were confined to Chinatown, fearing them to be spreading bubonic plague and smallpox, while in Honolulu in 1899, the Chinatown was burnt down, citing a spread of plague. The residents packed into refugee camps. In Tulsa in 1921 and Los Angeles in 1924, authorities systematically quarantined and then dismantled Black and Mexican American neighborhoods, respectively, declaring them as public health hazards and eventually promoting real estate development which did not house the previous inhabitants. The continuing outbreaks of malaria in tropical countries, especially among people with low or no immunity to the disease who have recently moved there, continue to be associated with specific places of origin and racist attitudes. This seems to be a continuation of Carlo Ginzburg's claim that the prodigious trauma of great pestilences intensifies the search for a scapegoat on which fears, hatreds, and tension of all kind would be discharged. So the Jews, the Chinese, the Mexicans, the blacks, and the natives. In 1918, a pandemic of influenza, now constantly being referred to as the Spanish flu, was incidentally called French flu in Spain. The epidemic killed more people in Asia than in Europe, including 18 million in India. Written immediately after the influenza epidemic, but imagined in reference to a plague epidemic, Albert Camus' The Plague also begins with suspicion at outsiders. The people of Oran, the fictional city, Algerian city of Oran, think that the outsiders may have dropped the dead rats in the city. In the early 1900s, Mary Malone, an Irish immigrant working in New York, was diagnosed as being an asymptomatic carrier of typhoid and apparently was responsible for 8 families contracting typhoid from her while she worked with them as a cook. Mary Malone was nicknamed Typhoid Mary and quarantined for 26 years till she died. If this so called super spreader was not an immigrant and a poor person, would the name have caught? Did the native population of South and North America stigmatize the Europeans who brought them disease and death? Did we call Columbus, cholera Columbus? The opposite continues even today. The HIV/AIDS pandemic saw entire African populations being vilified across Europe and the United States. And India was not very far. Do you remember this scene from Madhur Bhandarkar's film Fashion, where Priyanka Chopra looks in horror at the black person she has been sleeping with? That horror is the horror of possibly having contracted AIDS, a horror that she did not experience when she was sleeping with other people. Even within Africa, the public health experts grappled with different understandings of the population deemed to be responsible for the epidemic. They seized upon the male migrant infector model as that appeared to be better than the African promiscuity model, which is what had been in circulation till then. Both models vilify the same vulnerable group of people, people forced to move across the African continent to work in lowly paid, high risk jobs. In fact, the connection of migration with HIV/AIDS is more complex and varied than the established medico penal sense of migrants spreading the disease. People present in conflict areas are more likely to get infected with the virus, their risks being increased with poverty, powerlessness, social instability, and marginalization. Alongside these, factors that increase the risk of getting HIV/AIDS are and other sexually transmitted infections are displacement, military activity, economic disruption, psychological stress, and increased migration. There has been recorded instances of infection, increased infection along migration routes. Their militarization, of course, always increases the infection because the military personnel are less likely to practice safe sex. And unfortunately, the question of reproductive health among refugees and migrants has hardly ever been addressed, resulting in a greater number of HIV and other STIs. A 2015 study conducted in the European Union more or less debunks the migrant spreader model of the HIV/AIDS. It finds that more than 63% of all migrants infected with the HIV were infected after they migrated to Europe, thereby effectively questioning the assumption that the migrants carry the infection with them. During the 2009 swine flu H1N1 epidemic, while the world had been bracing to fight this, the Mexican and Hispanic immigrants into the US were being called mules. The word mule means the offspring of a donkey and a horse, but it has two overtones. Anyway, a lot of border security discourse centers around the Hispanic people being mules or carriers for drug lords. So they carry drugs. And now, when they were being called mules, they were not merely carrying supposedly drugs, but also the virus. An important politician said, illegal aliens are the carriers of the swine avian flu, as if legal immigrants are immune to the virus. The other is, of course, the dehumanization implicit in the comparison, visible in the attitude towards Mexican immigrants by the officials and security agencies. The Zika and Ebola were both called African viruses, despite the origin of Zika in 2015 in Brazil. This hatred and suspicion of an external identity came to a fore when in 2020, US President Donald Trump called the novel coronavirus a Chinese virus. The WHO 2015 World Health Organization 2015 guideline states that disease names really do matter to the people who are directly affected. It has been seen that certain disease names provoke a backlash against members of particular religious or ethnic communities, create unjustified barriers to travel, commerce, and trade, and trigger needless slaughtering of food animals. You might remember the killing of pigs during swine flu and that of chicken during bird flu. But despite the WHO's very strong guidelines, this tendency of naming viruses, at least informally, upon their place of origin has not stopped. From Calcutta, nurses who hail from the northeast of India were evacuated by their respective states because while they were going about their duties, they were being called racist names, jeered at, and abused. In Pune, a nurse from the northeast of India was attacked by a man who threw his tiffin box at her. Music superstar Chan circulated a video in which he had to speak in Hindi and say that he is not a virus. While Calcutta man Francis E. Lepcha in this photo wore a t-shirt that declared, I am not a coronavirus. I was born in Calcutta. I have never been to China. In a suburb near Calcutta, violence was unleashed upon the resident Muslim community, burning their homes and destroying property, fueled by the rumors, and these rumors were state sponsored. The central government repeatedly said this, fueled by rumors that Muslims spread coronavirus. It seems historically, fear of the migrant, of those who are distinctly different or perceived to be so, have been constantly invoked in times of societal stress, especially the stress engendered by a new disease. We now come to the second part of the presentation, where we look at the existing vulnerabilities and fault lines in societies, where the already vulnerable and marginalized become even more so. In the invocation of the new normal, we tend to forget that the normal of before was not necessarily equitable, just, or democratic. Differences abound, physical in terms of gender and class, caste, race, religion, location, access, and in this section we will flag a few of them. In the present coronavirus crisis, there has been a lot of discussion around comorbidities or underlying health conditions that make people especially vulnerable to death from the infection. While appearing to be a matter related to merely an individual's body, we need to remember that health, and in fact human bodies, are socially constructed and determined. Hence, comorbidities are created and influenced by existing social conditions, access to food, nutrition, conditions of living, exposure to contagion, etc. Sharon David studied the conditions of English society immediately before and after the Black Death or plague pandemic of the 14th century. She demonstrates that by the end of the 13th century, approximately 70% of the English were living below the poverty line, impacted by population growth, fast outpacing agricultural produce, and recurrent famines. So she studies 20,000 skeletons buried during the Black Death, and she shows that severe malnutrition was one of the determining factors that affected the mortality outcomes of the pandemic. From this, and from the examples that we are going to analyze next, a common theme emerges. It claims that in terms of epidemics and other societal stress, the existing fissures in society become even more prominent. People who are already vulnerable in any society, either for structural reasons or for prejudice, suffer the burden of the epidemic. This is a political ecology approach which claims that individual bodies are located within broader structures of power, revealing unequal exposure to conditions that produce poor health. So, if you are poor, you are more likely to be exposed to conditions which undermine your health. Similar examples can be found in the case of malaria epidemics in India. Sheila Zorbrig cites the important work done by S.R. Christophers. Through analyzing Thana or police Thana-wise mortality figures due to malaria in Punjab presidency at the turn of the 20th century, Christopher showed that malaria mortality was highest in areas which were already devastated by famines. He concludes that malaria reached epidemic proportions when acute hunger had already been in existence. In the current pandemic, data from the United States and the UK show that people from what is in its racist yet politically correct parlance called the ethnic minority backgrounds, such as Black, Latinx people, and South Asian people, have been impacted disproportionately. The reason is not generic, but historically and continuing lack of access to healthcare, as well as to housing, sanitation, daycare, childcare, transport, finance, history of discrimination leading to mounting stress, employment in high risk sectors like healthcare facilities, factories, farms, grocery stores, and public transport, and in the case of recent immigrants, lack of access to correct and relevant information in a language they are conversant in. These examples span 600 years. Yet, so from the Black Death of the 14th century to the malaria at the end of the 19th century and mid 20, early 2020s. However, their similarity could not be more striking. In the beginning of September this year, my friend got a call from her friend. Let's call my friend A and her friend B. B was walking down a busy intersection in South Calcutta when she saw a woman without any clothes sitting at the bus stop. B tried to speak to this woman, a woman of robust physique and short hair. It seemed she had recently been thrown out of home. B bought her a nightie, but in no time the woman tore it into bits. When A and her two colleagues reached the spot, they had better luck. They gave her a phone to listen to music on, which calmed her down. She told them her name, that she is from Kharagpur, a district headquarter about 200 kilometers away from Calcutta. They got in touch with a famous mental health practitioner who called the police, who, after protracted negotiations, escorted the woman to the government mental hospital, Pavlov. The good doctor asked my friend B over the phone, "Do you think she has been assaulted? Do you think she has been abused?" My friend was convinced that no one would assault a stray person for fear of coronavirus infection. But her colleagues were not so certain. They had seen bruises on her breasts and her stomach was distended. On 14 September 2020, the same day that the Indian government denied any knowledge of migrant workers' death due to the lockdown, a nurse working in an immigration detention facility in Georgia in the US turned whistleblower and filed a complaint against the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE. She claimed that most women in the detention center were made to undergo hysterectomy in the detention center without any medical reason for the same. The excessive force used by the ICE and the deplorable conditions in the detention centers have been in the media for quite some time now. But the specific instance speaks more about an existing patriarchal society's reactions towards women's bodies and the control of their reproductive health. It unfortunately also has unfortunate connotations with treating women in a camp like situation as experimental objects. It has resonances with colonial and later practices of forcibly sterilizing marginalized women. This example brings together almost all the crucial concerns of our societies: the distrust of migrants, the need to control women's bodies, and the repressive state mechanism that grows stronger. The detention center is a place that demarcates between the citizen and the non citizen, a space exceptional in its criminalization of a population which isn't criminal. And during the coronavirus pandemic, the women are now being relieved of their reproductive functions in the detention center. My submission then here is, when the differences are ordered and mapped onto the human body, pandemic induced stress also works to disproportionately reduce the bodily dignity, autonomy, and integrity of the marginalized. On 15 September 2020, the Indian government claimed that the migrant exodus from their places of work in March, April, and May in India happened due to fake news or misinformation. After the Shramik train started plying, many of us were shocked and saddened at the video of 35-year-old Avrina Khatun, who died on the train while her infant child tried to play with her covered corpse. In another instance, on a 8th May news video by ABP News, covered a migrant worker who gave birth on the road before continuing with her journey. These are exceptional instances, but they also point at deeper structural problems with reproductive health. The same time as the news about forced hysterectomy hit us, the Telegraph reported that the rate of giving birth to stillborn children in India has increased fourfold since the lockdown. The reasons: crucial workers who look after pregnant and infant health or are already who were already overworked and unpaid have been diverted towards tackling the coronavirus. In many cases, healthcare centers in villages have been converted into quarantine facilities or corona hospitals for patients with mild or no symptoms, resulting in a complete absence of consultation during any stage whatsoever of pregnancy for many women. It's not very different from the urban poor. Government hospitals that were designated COVID hospitals completely shut down their maternity wards at the beginning of the lockdown, leaving poor urban women and women from the suburbs helpless. A PTI report dated 29th August states that at least 61 women and 877 newborn died in the northeastern state of Meghalaya alone in April to June 2020 due to lack of admission to the hospitals and the diversion of maternal care facilities. We have to remember that India's public health infrastructure was already bursting at the seams with the lowest per capita government expenditure and budgetary allowance. And during the pandemic, some of the first services to be cut have been those directed at pregnant women and mothers and newborn children. Reports of domestic violence increased all over the world during the lockdown. And in West Bengal, we were witness to the stunning piece of news that a family refused to send the housewife to the hospital after she tested positive for the coronavirus, because then there would be no one to cook for the family. In middle and upper middle class households, a significant amount of care work is undertaken by the domestic worker, who's either a long-time migrant from neighboring states or district, or someone who travels from the suburbs or slums. The lockdown often resulted in them losing their jobs due to travel restrictions as well as widespread fear against the outsider, which also disproportionately increased the load of care work upon middle class and upper middle class women who were working at home. All over the world, 74% of migrant women work in the domestic and nursing service sector, and a large number of them reported loss of pay and therefore their inability to send money back home, being trapped in their place of work without income due to the closure of borders and travel restrictions, and the increased risk of infection due to the cramped conditions they live in. The other bodily function with which women are differentially treated is menstrual hygiene. And it is not a surprise to notice that most of the relief packages being distributed to migrant workers, either walking back or stranded at various places, did not contain sanitary products. But even more worrying is the news that in the packages that did contain sanitary products, men who received them did not think twice before throwing it out on the road, instead of handing it to women who may or may not need them. Sex workers reported almost debilitating impoverishment during the pandemic, and they were often powerless enough to force their clients into taking precautions. On the other hand, across South Asia, child marriage increased as these instances of trafficking. What happens to different sexualities during the pandemic? It is not news to anyone that gay men and men who have sex with men were considered to be the single pronged bearers of the HIV, and they continue to be disproportionately affected by the same. But increasingly, biomedical experts are reaching the consensus that discrimination and homophobia perpetuate the HIV/AIDS epidemic among gay men and MSMs. It becomes even more among men who belong to marginalized communities, So, vulnerabilities piled on top of one another create a higher probability of an epidemiological infection. Under the present pandemic, the UN AIDS report notes HIV positive people have found it difficult to access their medication. For many, treatments have completely stopped, increasing the fear that the achievements of the past few years will now be derailed. As in the case of the reporting of domestic violence since the lockdown, the calls to LGBTQ helplines run by various NGOs went up drastically, as did the perceived need for on call and online counseling sessions. There's a very good reason for this. The home where one is supposed to stay, we have been told stay at home. The home has historically been the site and location of violence, discrimination, and trauma for the LGBTQ community. They have had to go back home during the many people who had left home and were living either by themselves or as part of a supportive community have had to go back home due to the lockdown and go back to the same taunts and harassments and in extreme cases violence that they had thought they had escaped. For people who had not come out to their families about their sexuality, they have had to hide their sexual and clothing preferences and pretend to be something they are not. People have been advised to press pause to not reveal their sexual orientation or gender identity if they hadn't already. But often it has been revealed to families inadvertently, unleashing new cycles of harassment and violence. It's especially harsh for trans people who are incapable of dressing the way they need to, as families have been forcing them to dress according to the gender assigned to them at birth. People undergoing transformative surgery have had a lack of access to their hormonal medicine and treatments, and in some cases, they have stopped them altogether. Access to an online identity and the ability to connect to like minded people has also often been difficult from home, with increasing surveillance from families, especially parents. Trans people and LGBT people have lost their jobs and income just like everyone else, especially the hijras who have been collected money at traffic intersections or after the birth of children. Even in the case of hospitalization, very few states in India have set up separate wards for trans persons. In fact, if they do need medical attention, they almost always run the risk of being misgendered. This is the same in the detention camps and in prisons as well. So, if we remember that persecution due to sexuality, gender identity, and sexual orientation is a significant reason that makes people seek asylum in first world countries, even in the place where they seek asylum, the encampment ensures further harassment. In India, even the educational sector, now completely online, and therefore beyond the grasp of rural and poor students, is also marked by gender. We remember Jamlo Makdam, the young girl who walked home before she died of exhaustion. We talk of her, but we forget to talk of her right to education. Migrant children are also part of this guarantee to education. We all know of the lack of access to online classes and the ensuing suicides that have taken place across India. Unfortunately, all of the reported instances are of young girls, daughters of agricultural workers, tribal and Dalit girls who have killed themselves incapable of attending classes. There's ample evidence that even in the sphere of higher education, access to internet and technology is gendered. If there is a computer at home, the male child is more likely to have access and proficiency to it than the female child. A small study taken in Nagaland reports that boy children have greater access to online classes than girls. If there is a scarcity of devices or internet bandwidth at home, then the boy gets to do his class, the girl doesn't. Not directly connected to this, but worth remembering, as I mentioned earlier, across South Asia, underage marriage of girl children have gone up drastically. One of the reasons might be that the schemes that paid for children's continuing education has fallen through, and increased impoverishment making the child's marriage important for the family's survival. This shows how misplaced my friend's faith was. That during COVID times, violence against women must have reduced. In Kerala, the ambulance driver driving a COVID positive young woman raped her. Another was raped in a quarantine facility. So it transpires even a disease that spreads with close physical contact doesn't ensure that sexual and physical violence towards the marginalized in society will stop. Instead, each crisis seems to make our fault lines deeper, more and more entrenched, making the most vulnerable even more so. If, in the example cited above, the case of gender is substituted by caste, something eerily similar emerges. 6 sanitation workers died in Chennai, several more in Bengaluru during the pandemic due to exposure to the coronavirus infection. It's common knowledge that sanitation in India has continued to be caste specific occupations. From private sanitation workers to municipality conservancy workers, in the best of times, the sanitation workers are Dalit or Dalit Muslim, underpaid, forced to live in ghettos, without personal protective gears, and without any social safety net. Himal South Asia report talks about Dalit sanitation workers in Bangladesh who have been asked to procure their own PPEs. In his lecture, The Dalit Citizen in Search of a Homeland, N. Sukumar reminisced about his initial reaction to the highly contagious nature of the coronavirus infection. At the beginning of the infection, he had assumed that the rest of the society would finally understand what untouchability feels like. But to his horror, he witnessed caste atrocities mounting even during lockdown, sanitation workers as being lauded as corona warriors, but being forced to do their jobs without basic protection. Many Dalits have been removed from their accommodations, while a Dalit man in Telangana died after being beaten by the police for not wearing a mask. People in government quarantine centers refuse to eat food cooked by Dalit people, just as some stranded migrant workers in Delhi had refused to accept food distributed by Muslims. These fault lines are inherent in the society. They point at the deepest injustices and inequalities that are intrinsic to our contemporary movement. The spectacular mobilization of the Black Lives Matter movement in the aftermath of the police killing of George Floyd cannot mask the police brutality that seeks out certain identities, even when there is a pandemic raging. It's ironic that for during the time of a disease where people cannot breathe and suffer from a lack of oxygen, George Floyd died saying, I can't breathe. We need to remember the refusal of states to release political prisoners, despite the cramped conditions in most prisons around the world, is also a symptom of the same. The differently able have also been disproportionately hit by the pandemic. For the visually challenged, the crucial element of touch is now the most difficult to come by, while the masks make lip reading impossible for those with hearing difficulties. Alzheimer's and dementia patients, as well as those that are neurodivergent, have been cut off from institutional support mechanisms, adversely affecting their well being and also that of their primary carers, often women. In the final section of this presentation, I will look at how migrants are affected by the pandemic. Let me lay out a few scenarios of global migration, and internal displacement today. The map on your left is the internal displacement map of the world. And let me examine how each of these have been affected by the pandemic. There are people stranded. There are migrant workers, typically contractual and lowly paid, who continue to go to work, putting themselves and others at risk, thereby also increasing xenophobia. The distinction between the citizen and the non-citizen has become more rarefied. Refugees and displaced people live in crowded and unsanitary conditions, making the risk of catching and spreading the disease much higher. And a curve of migration does not mean the end of migration. It makes migration more unsafe. In 2019, there were an estimated 292 million migrants in the world, according to a UN report, with India being the biggest producer of migrants and US the biggest recipient. There were 50.8 million internally displaced people across the world, most of which as a result of conflict, but one-fifth of it also as a result of natural disaster. If we just look at India in 2020, we find people displaced from certain parts of Delhi as a result of violence and from the Sundarbans as a result of the super cyclone. Over the last 6 months, we in India have been shocked by the callous treatment of the migrant workers by the government, their deaths on the road, the deaths on the trains, on the railway lines, and at the threshold of their homes. These are only some of the people stranded. Indian workers were stranded in Nepal and Nepalese workers stranded in India. India had sent flights to rescue Indians who were being denied medical care in Iran around the beginning of the lockdown, but no worker had been rescued from Nepal, the neighboring country. The pandemic's economic effect cannot merely be measured in terms of rupees or the GDP, but it has to be counted on by as the effect on human lives. The same thing is happening elsewhere. Afghan refugees in Iran have been going back despite knowing that they had it worse back home. Venezuela's migrants are going back from Colombia to Venezuela. And if you see a video available on YouTube of the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan, you realize that the moment the border was opened, thousands of people rushed back into Afghanistan within a matter of minutes. Italy and Greece were not allowing refugee boats to land on their beaches, while refugee camps were growing in the Turkey-Greece border because the Greece border was closed and the Turkey one open. We remember that societies today are more or less governed over the specter of the migrant who steals our jobs and eats our food, from whose threat we have to make our country great again. But in reality, migrant workers mostly work in low-paid temporary jobs in the service sector, in agriculture and construction. Their job contracts are non-existent and they continue to go to work also in unsanitary conditions, putting themselves and others at risk. In countries that have been attempting to bring back their people from other countries, the distinction between citizen and non-citizen has been very stark. Germany allowed its citizens to come back from Peru and Turkey, but not its long-time residents. It was initially the same for India. Indian citizens would be allowed on planes, but not those with an overseas citizen of India card. Countries that have strong social security measures like the US and the UK, these measures like the dole or the payment for to the unemployed is only meant for the citizens. So even if you are a long-time resident and have been unemployed, you won't get any of the benefits. My friend Karma is a Tibetan refugee residing in Nepal. His wife is a Tibetan refugee from India. They had a child late last year and they have not yet been able to meet. Because anyway, movement for a refugee is difficult. Now, being non-citizens of either country, it is as if they do not have rights. In other instances, things like migrant centers, soup kitchens, shelters for the homeless have been stopped. The migrants have nowhere to turn to. This image is a graffiti in Berlin asking the government to leave no one behind. So if you are bringing your people back, you bring everyone back. Refugees are easily the worst hit among the different kinds of migrants we have been talking about. With borders being closed, there are thousands of Syrian refugees stranded in Turkey. While the Turkish border is open, the Greek one is not. There are Rohingyas living in boats, asylum seekers living in camps along the US-Mexico border, Karen refugees in the US living without any aid. Refugees in Indonesia have isolated themselves just in case they contract the infection. Rohingyas in camps in Bangladesh, Syrian refugees on Italy-Austria border, and most recently, the Moira refugee camp in the Greek island in Lesbos went up in flames, leaving 13,000 people without shelter. But is this going to end migration as we know it? No, because more than anything else, the globalized world order and global economy depends on cheap labor of the migrant worker. Even in India, UP and Gujarat have started to dilute labor laws, and now central government has done the same. If countries do this to their own citizens, the migrant workers who anyway do not have any means to organize have much rights will prove to be even cheaper. But even before the pandemic, governments across the world had made their immigration laws stricter. In the US, people who were likely to become public charge, that is, people who might pose additional burden on the government, for example, people with chronic diseases who want to immigrate for better health care, are gradually becoming inadmissible. For a few days, the ICE wanted overseas students to be sent home if they were not attending university classes physically. But despite that, people will migrate because they need to. With increasing hostility and securitization, migration is likely to move more and more underground, controlled mostly by smugglers and traffickers. But was this the only way? Ebola response has shown that community participation is key to controlling the epidemic. The most vulnerable, that is, the most marginalized, have to be at the center of any epidemic control measures. They have to be the decision makers, not the ones who are being forced to follow decisions. In Africa, combating Ebola required participation of faith leaders, patients' rights groups, and communities. Lessons from Zika response showed the fallacy of controlling borders, since such control is justified more by prejudice against certain groups than by data. But the pandemic also has shown states resorting to criminal law using the excuse of public health. In India, we witnessed some of the harshest forms of such violence, with the police beating and killing people for venturing out during lockdown, and in its most extreme instance, arresting, torturing, raping, and murdering a father and son duo in Tamil Nadu because they kept their shop open during the lockdown. And epidemic control cannot be the reason behind suspension of civil liberties. Neither can the management of an epidemic, the war on it, come at the cost of human rights. State and international responses must be geared towards the most vulnerable, the elderly, the poor, the non citizen. Only then would the new normal aspire to be better than the normal that used to be. The impact of HIV related travel restrictions is still being felt far and wide. The impact of the COVID 19 related draconian measures cannot yet be fully fathomed. If former epidemics have taught us one thing, that is, each epidemic irretrievably changes the societies that we have known. But how will it change this society is something whose answer only the future can bring. Thank you.